So this is the Sony XBA-N3, or just the N3 for short. It was released in 2017, so going on pretty much 8 years at this point, and it was released as the precursor to the Sony IEM, pretty much Sony's legendary flagship IEM. And we see this inspired in the driver design. It's pretty much just a reduced design, where it uses one dynamic driver for the bass in the mid-range, and then it uses a tweeter, a balanced armature, for the highs. So at release, I believe the price for this IEM was 300 USD. Now, if I had to describe this IEM in like 2 words, just to sum it up, it would be as unconventionally great. And this is reflected in a lot of ways, one of which is not, however, the ergonomics of this IEM. So as you can see, it has a bit of an unconventional design where the back of the IEM houses the dynamic driver's chamber, and then the nozzle of the IEM is a bit elongated to accommodate the tweeter. So what you get is an IEM that is intended to be worn bullet style, and it inserts like so. Now, mind you, this is not the stock cable. However, it does kind of pull down on the IEM, and as you can see, like if you don't have very large ears, because this is a bullet style IEM, the IEM might stick out just a little bit. And at the same time, because of the weight of this cable, it kind of just pulls down on the IEM itself, and it feels like the IEMs are going to fall out of your ears. And that's the reason why I have this little clip here. Again, this is not the stock cable, but it's kind of the same story with the stock cable, which I have as well. Okay, but let's talk about why I actually purchased this IEM. So I heard it around 3 years ago, I think, from someone on Discord who reached out and lent it to me, or maybe it was Super Review. I can't remember which one of us it was. But I heard the IEM, and I was honestly pretty shocked when I first heard it. So when this same person put up the N3 like a month or two later, I was on it in like under 20 minutes. So I've had it since then, and I've listened to it since then, and it's just been I guess I would say it's my comfort pick whenever I'm kind of bored of some of my other sets and I just want something that I know aligns very closely with my personal preferences. So if you're not familiar with what U-shaped tuning is, this is just a style of tuning where the sub bass and the upper treble are usually boosted accordingly, and the mid-range tends to be more relaxed. And just putting my money where my mouth is, this is where the vast majority of IEMs that I've purchased for myself have ended up in terms of tuning. In terms of all these IEMs with U-shaped tuning though, and what my personal favorite would be, my ideal U-shaped tuning, I would say that the N3 probably falls pretty much close to the top of the list. So the best way I can describe the tuning of this IEM is like sinfully addictive. And just to put this into context, I have a pretty varied music library. You know, I listen to a lot of country music, but then at the same time, I also listen to like K-pop and J-pop. And these are very contrasting genres in my opinion. And honestly, like listening to the N3, I can swap between these two genres effortlessly. Obviously, I don't think it's the best IEM out there. You know, like there are IEMs that are tuned similarly and just have better technicalities. But when it comes to like what I would rank, like its pure tonality, its tuning overall, it would easily be S tier or like a 9 out of 10 for me. It's really just that close when it comes to hitting my subjective preferences. Okay, so let's talk about the bass response. The bass response of this definitely bleeds a little bit into the lower mid-range. It bleeds into 300 to maybe like even 500 hertz, just a touch. And then just under 200 hertz in general, it has quite a lot of presence. So it's definitely a bass response that makes itself known. And incidentally, if you line up the measurements with the 64 Audio Neo, it measures pretty much identically in the bass response to that IEM when the Neo is using the M15 module. The Neo is an IEM that I purchased because I really loved its bass response. Similar to the Neo, the N3 has a bass response that is a bit dirty. I would definitely call it a dirty bass response, where it might come across as somewhat bloated to some listeners, and it's definitely not the most detailed as well. However, in terms of like the authenticity of the bass response and the way notes sound, I would say it's very high up there in that regard. So the transients in general are quite dense and thick, and the bloom that you get from the decay of bass notes is just very natural sounding. It sounds kind of elongated. And in terms of like the note attack, like I said, this is not the most conventionally detailed IEM. It's not going to give you that slammy characteristic that you'll get from, you know, IEMs with a sharper bass shelf. However, it's more of an impactful experience where it sounds like that driver is pushing air and bass notes have a lot of body behind them. So moving upwards, you definitely have a quite worn mid-range. Like I said, the N3's bass bleeds a bit into that 400 to 500 hertz region. And then in addition to that, you have a pin notched at around 2.5K hertz, which is going to just give you a more colored mid-range in general. At the same time, while this is a U-shaped IEM, I would not say that the vocals on it are like muffled or extremely recessed to any degree. And the reason for this is owing to a number of factors. One is just that rise from 1 to 2K hertz. It's not aggressive, but it is appropriate. And then it does have a little bump of energy at around 4K hertz in the upper mid-range. And then to top it off, it does have a decent amount of upper treble, which is going to add some bite to the upper harmonics of a lot of female vocals in particular. Now, the treble of the N3 is an interesting talking point. Just reading impressions online and reviews online over the years, it seems to me that a lot of people consider the N3 to be a darker IEM and for the treble to be one of its biggest weaknesses. On the contrary, I don't find this to be a dark IEM at all. And I will caveat this with the fact that I've looked at a lot of measurements online of the N3, and I do see a good deal of variance in the treble measurements. And part of this, just might have to do with differences in couplers. Not all couplers are created equal, and they tend to measure quite differently in the 10 to 20K hertz region. However, I do see enough anecdotal evidence just from what I'm seeing online to maybe suggest that there is quality control differences in the tweeter that Sony was using. Now, talking about how my own N3 sounds, which again might be a Goldilocks unit for all I know, what I hear at least is a very sparkly and well extended treble response. So yeah, it's definitely mid-treble focused with a good deal of energy from 10 to 15K hertz. At the same time, it is by no means unnatural sounding. There's a nice weight to the treble transients, and you don't really get any of that BA timbre, that scratchy or rough characteristic that you could get with a lot of balanced armature setups at the time of which this was released. I think a lot of balanced armature setups today even are still, they have their own timbre issues. They sound unnatural in their own ways, and that's because they're boosting treble frequencies which should not be being boosted. And this IEM, the N3, its tweeter setup avoids a lot of that. So what's pretty shocking about the N3, or at least my unit, is that it measures better than every Z1R, Sony Z1R that I've measured, as well as the M9, the M7, and pretty much any other Sony IEM that I've heard. I really wouldn't say it's a stretch to say that this N3 that I have, it measures better than pretty much any sub $300 IEM in the treble response. So something that I'll point out really quickly is that most IEMs in the $300 to $500 range are not tuned like this at all anymore. A lot of them do not have that more generous bass shelf, and they cut off instead at around 200 hertz for a very sharp sub-bass response. And most of these IEMs, again, do not have that more colored pin notch at 2.5K hertz, and nor do they have that treble response that the N3 has. The bottom line is that if you like this type of tuning and you want it in today's market, you're not going to be paying $300 or even $500 for it. You're going to be paying much more, and it's closer to around $1,000 now, which is where the U4S steps in and you get this type of tuning done correctly and where it sounds good. Just generally speaking, I think one thing I really like about this IEM is that the timbre on it is very, very natural. You really don't get any of that quote unquote BA timbre that usually stems from a recession from 10 to 15K hertz or unnatural peaks in the treble. You really don't get any of that with this IEM. The timbre just sounds very organic. So the other really nice thing about this, of course, is that it sounds very coherent as well. If I did not know any better, I would probably guess that this was a single dynamic driver IEM if I heard it blind. So yeah, let's talk about intangible performance really quick. Contrary again to what a lot of people have said online about this IEM, I really don't find the detail to be lacking. And a lot of this I think stems from the treble response on my unit. Because it measures well in those upper treble frequencies, it again creates that kind of, extra sense of depth to the upper harmonics of vocals. And the extension, the full range extension in general, just means that you kind of hear everything that's going on in a track. Now, with that being said, I do find the imaging of this IEM to be pretty average. It might even be below average if I'm being honest. The soundstage in general and the way it images is just very 3-blob, left, right, and then center. And its layering ability, so like the extent to which you're able to distinguish where individual instruments are coming from on the stage is just kind of like cluttered. It's just not easy to do so. So as for why this IEM never really got the recognition it deserved, I think that there are a number of reasons for that. One of them could have just been price sensitivity. At the time of which this was released, it was $300. And while that might not seem like a lot by today's standards, after all, we have IEMs that are $3,000 now, at the time, $300 was $500 accounting for inflation. And the most expensive IEMs at that time were like maybe $1,500 maximum. So just in general, there was a lot more price sensitivity around IEMs at that time. In addition to that, Sony is also incredibly bad at marketing their wired IEMs. I don't think that they ever sent out like review units or they did any like marketing in general. And we can kind of see that, just from the IER-Z1R itself. It's been their flagship IEM for like 6-7 years, maybe even longer at this point. And they just really do not seem to care about their wired IEMs very much. The third reason why this IEM probably did not catch on is just, educational standards around good tuning at the time. And because of that, I think a lot of reviewers were pushing and hyping up IEMs that probably should not have been getting hyped up. A lot of them sounded pretty fucking bad. And if you hop on HeadFi and you start, scouring back in time, you'll find plenty of examples of that. And the final reason, of course, could just be unit variance. This was a proprietary tweeter that Sony was using, and it's possible that their QC was not the greatest with it. And that in turn led to mixed impressions between adopters of this IEM. Okay, so if there is a big takeaway from the N3, I think it's that the IEM market and just audio in general is very susceptible to external factors, artificial factors like marketing and hype that kind of decide what qualifies good sound. And a lot of the time, there's sometimes merit behind what, becomes popular. But at the same time, there are a lot of IEMs that are, actually good out there that kind of fly under the radar and that deserve more recognition. And that's what this video is about. I'm trying to give this IEM the spotlight that it probably deserved like 8 years ago. Now, I think a very good question would be whether I would still buy this IEM at its current price. This IEM is discontinued, so you can no longer purchase it new. However, there are examples that come up on the used market, and you can buy a used example on Amazon right now, I think, for around like 360 USD. Just being transparent, at $360, this would not be a buy for me, just because I don't want to deal with the potential of there being, like unit variance and me getting a bad unit. At $300 though, if I could measure it, and I knew that it sounded good beforehand, that would definitely be a buy for me. At $250, same story. At $200, that's when I would be in like blind buy territory, and I would be willing to buy it blind and take the risk of it being not the best sounding in the treble response. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope it was a nice little walk down memory lane and a look at an IEM that is, I think, at least a little underappreciated. And yeah, I will catch you guys in my next video. Thanks so much for watching, and peace out until next time.